Hello, welcome to Wheat from the Chaff on the Farmgate podcast channel. I'm Costain, the chief editor of 8.9.com.
And I'm Joe Stanley, writer and head of sustainable farming at the Allerton Project.
And today we're going to discuss a report calling for a radical war-scale change in the UK food system. We'll consider Dieter Helm's proposals for the future of UK farming. We'll look at a recent Lloyds report on helping farmers address climate and nature risk and talk through the virtues or otherwise of introducing US-style class actions to the UK to address environmental degradation. But let's start with the Roadmap to Resilience, which is a report from the AFN Network Plus. Now, Joe, we put a headline here which was taken from a quote within the article on 8.9, and it was "Radical War-Scale Transformation Needed in the UK Food System." Now, I'm often a bit reluctant to kind of use phrases like this, war scale, because it's all a bit militaristic and not always helpful. But at the same time, it does give us a sense of the scale of the challenge that they're talking about. But at the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that they've quite got the challenge right. So let's start off by putting it in context. So we've got here the Roadmap for Resilience, a UK food plan for 2050, calls for radical transformation at a pace and scale not seen since the Second World War. It says, if we do not act now, then change will be forced upon us by increasing pressures, and the UK will lurch from crisis to crisis, including from food price shocks, climate disasters, and weakening economic productivity. The report states the UK food system faces pressures that make transformation inevitable. Our food and farming landscapes will change radically over the next half century, whether we like it or not. And the question is whether we actively manage change for the public good or respond haphazardly as changes are forced upon us. We only have a brief window, it says. Now, the point really that I wanted to pick up here, in terms of that statement that I made earlier on, that yes, this is a massive food system transformation that we're looking at. Yes, they have articulated that this change is necessary. They've highlighted three sort of core areas of change and 10 points within that. But I always feel that conversations about food security start too low down the sort of pecking order. It feels to me that food security in and of itself is a secondary challenge, and we need to understand the primary challenge before we then start addressing the food security element. And my feeling is that yet again, there is a report that doesn't quite get this. And I guess what I'm talking about is the need to have a cold assessment of the security threat. What is the security threat globally? Because I've never seen one in relation to food that really accounts for geopolitics, looks at terrorism and war, cyber attacks, all that sort of stuff, but then looks at the pressures on fuel and fertilizer use, on pesticide, etc., on how that geopolitics might impact on these things, at the same time as then assessing how climate change and weather is going to change things as we move forward, how biodiversity, fits in with that, the skills gap, food distribution, a whole range of different things. So we're looking at the security landscape before we then start sort of fitting food within it. So we're making the case properly for change.
Well, I think what you've just done there, ffinlo, is to highlight the immensity of the challenge, the immensity of the topic when we're talking about this issue. And this report in and of itself is really wide-reaching. As you say, there's three kind of key calls for transformation, three key areas that it highlights: stronger, more resilient farming, smarter, more integrated land use, and healthier diets made easier. Now, any one of those is a huge topic in and of itself, and then it's got 10 key recommendations following on from that. But yeah, you're right, Phil. I mean, look, we consistently underplay the importance of this whole kind of food security, food self-sufficiency issue, and then we sort of consistently continue to treat individual bits of it in isolation. So for me, this report is it's really good. I mean, it's repeating much of what we've seen in reports for years now. I think the striking thing about it is that, frankly, it's largely just repeating things that we kind of already know, yet again. And I guess for me, I completely take your point, ffinlo, that even in and of itself, it doesn't go far enough to look at those kind of wider, more underlying challenges to our food security. And yeah, I mean, a radical war scale transformation of how we look at our food system. I suppose really what that is saying is that ultimately, until we get to sort of a war situation as society, we tend to ignore the big issues. We tend to ignore those intractable problems that we face. So it's kind of a handy shorthand way of saying how important it is that we put resource into this. But the question I guess I would ask at this point is what therefore continue to be the blockers to actually taking all of these myriad reports that we get and actually implementing them into both government policy, supply chain policy, and social consciousness. Why do we continue to not act on these reports? And I think the cliff edge is that, again, this report highlights, lead author, I think, was Tim Benton, who's only too aware of those kind of geopolitical and climate issues, that you talked about there, Finlo, through his current work at Chatham House. What continues to be the thing that gets us closer to that cliff edge that we're continually warned about without really doing anything to address the issues?
And I think it really is. It's a failure to address and expand upon, to explain that higher level element, because I think there is a real sort of tendency within government. I mean, government, we keep hearing this phrase, don't we? Food security is national security, without any kind of sense of what that means. And it's a drum that I've been banging for a long time. I completely agree that food is fundamental to national security, but we need to understand that in a global context.
Aren't you
And
the country's leading food security podcast, Finlay?
this is indeed, yeah. Farmgate has become the world's leading food
The
security podcast.
world's.
The
There we go.
world's, yeah,
There we
highest
go.
ranking. So I mean, quite apart from anything else, I thought we probably ought to discuss it. But there is this sort of sense, I think, within government, that if push comes to shove, then we can simply produce more food. We kind of reference back as human beings, as individuals, to the last time that we faced a comparative challenge in this way. And I think, a lot of people look back at the Second World War and they say, well, we coped then. That wasn't, we had to make some changes, but ultimately we got through it. That was okay. And the kind of challenges that we're expecting to face as a result of human response to environmental degradation. I don't want to just say that it's environmental degradation, it's how humans respond to that and to the migratory pressures that are likely to come from that. This is, I think it's going to be really challenging. And so if you look back at the Second World War, I think we kind of need to stop being quite so starry-eyed about the way that society is in comparison with then. Our population's more than doubled in terms of what it was in 1940. The way that we use land is entirely different. The way that we distribute food is different. The way that people's experience, people's knowledge of how to use their own gardens is different, quite apart from the fact that an awful lot of people simply don't have gardens. They live in very, very dense urban populations. And so actually the challenge, even if we're just talking about, producing food in the UK, it's really very different. And I've not seen an analysis of that. I don't know if you have.
No, and it scares the concept of shortages within the economy scares the hell out of me, because I think if we know enough about human behavior kind of at that kind of macro level to know that humans are panicky, and largely self-interested beasts, right? We saw what happened during COVID when there was even the suggestion that there might be shortages of things, and then all of a sudden there's panic buying, hoarding, and the food system couldn't cope with that level of strain. And that was when there wasn't a supply side issue. If there is a genuine supply side issue, I expect that to be significantly magnified. So yeah, I mean, look, it really does. It scares me that the thought that we could start to see these significant shortages, that we're still continuing to just ignore that this is even a possibility. And look, again, this report is calling for, again, placing food security on a par with energy security. And we now have a food security minister. The new Labour government, when it came in, it changed the farming minister to a food security minister. And yet, Finlay, we've talked enough about this in the last year or so. This government really couldn't have done any more to undermine food security in the last 12 months or so. So we are absolutely still nowhere on this. So again, for me, why do we continue to completely ignore this as an issue, despite the number of very well-meaning, very detailed reports that come out? Fundamentally, I don't think society, and I don't think politicians, and I don't think the food supply chain even is really fundamentally taking this seriously. And
No.
I don't know how much we can continue to bang that drum.
And I think part of it again is this sort of the phrase food security, because I think there's food security has existed throughout my lifetime. I'm 53 now, but it is every decade of my lifetime, I think that what food security means has changed to a certain extent. And certainly in the 70s and the 80s, there really was this sense that food security meant being able to produce loads of food at home, as and when that time came. And I don't think that, I mean, although when you think within groups like the AFN Network Plus, and in conversations that we've had in various different sort of think tanky type things that we've been involved in, there is an understanding that food security is about more than this, but there's a need for phrases that genuinely kind of elicit the response from policymakers that don't think about it regularly to understand what it means. And I think that food resilience, in the same way that we talk about farm resilience, is a much better way of talking through what we're talking about. Because again, just sort of going back to that idea, if there was essentially a global war, global conflict of some kind, no matter how that arises, and there are interruptions to fuel and fertilizer and various other things that we import, let alone the food that physically comes in, how would we address that? And I don't think that we can just currently assume that we're going to be able to grow our way out of that because of the skills gap, because of the fertility gap, because of the fact that we have this hugely variable weather now that we haven't been used to in the past. And so it feels to me, and I'm jumping ahead to a conclusion, and actually I think there's a job of work to be done to look at what different people think that food resilience or food security might look like, and then to start addressing those, thinking about those scenarios seriously, breaking them down, testing them to see whether they actually hold up. But ultimately, it seems to me that you cannot have food security and food resilience without essentially a regenerative approach, an agroecological approach, which is a fundamentally enormous change in the way that the system works, and without greater distribution diversity within that as well. So you're addressing the skills gap really rapidly. You're addressing soil fertility and biodiversity loss, the importance of mycorrhizal fungi and everything else within the soil. You're addressing the fact that you need to be able to produce food regardless of the weather, and therefore that water holding capacity is so important within the soil. At the same time as having a clear view of what that world looks like. And if we're thinking about having to produce food for our own population without any imports, without the fuel and fertilizer that we currently import, what does that look like? Because it's only when we have a sense of what that looks like and we can be honest in that assessment that we can start building towards it.
Absolutely, and there are so many points of failure in that resilient food. We have an incredibly unresilient food system at the moment, and this is why when I was farming back home, I really seriously looked at shifting to organic production, because again, what scared me was the thought of and this was pre-Ukraine. What scared me was the thought of fertilizer quadrupling in price, and what would that do to the resilience of my farm business. And of course, that is the benefit of moving towards an organic system, right? You are divorcing yourself from a requirement to actually depend on those external inputs. Now, of course, for me, there's lots of problems with an organic system, but that's one of the huge benefits of that system. And it is that resilience that you talk about that, again, I think is fundamentally misunderstood by people all across kind of, if you like, the food system, and certainly especially policymakers who don't realize that we are almost entirely dependent on that flow of external to the UK inputs, machinery, labor, fertilizers coming in, agrochemicals. And absolutely, everything we can do to reduce that dependence is incredibly valuable. But again, look, I agree with 9.5 out of 10 of the recommendations of this report. But when are we going to start to take this seriously? And coincidentally, the one I have a question mark about, as usually with these reports, is, as always, the requirement for dietary change and for less cattle, basically. as seems to be just de rigueur with anything when we talk about the food system. There's this automatic assumption that we need to just have less ruminants. And again, I think in a regenerative farming system, I would love to see the piece of work done that tells us in a genuinely regenerative farming system, do we need less cattle and sheep, more cattle and sheep, or about the same number in order to regenerate our soils? I would love, in a changing climate where grass and swards are going to be the most resilient land use that we can have, I would love to see that piece of work done.
Yeah, one of the priority actions I'm not sure that I agree with is creating a national food system transformation committee, because the idea of just yet another committee when actually we just need to be mobilizing thought, and consciousness within the committees that we have and getting them to work together very often on these various different things.
Well, the war ags got a lot done, Finlo. Back in the day, the war ags got a lot done.
Fair enough, fair enough. Just on that sort of second priority action, targets for dietary change and animal numbers, did it specifically say further into the report that it was talking about ruminants, or is that an assumption on your part, Joe?
I mean, I'm guessing when we start talking about livestock numbers, we're always talking about cows and sheep, basically. I mean, that's the way it always goes, right? We're too much, because one of the big focuses of this report is also the environmental impact of it's not a food security report, which perhaps we've given a slightly misleading, it's also
a food system report.
It's a food system report. It's also talking significantly about the environmental impact of British agriculture. So yeah, look, I mean, yes, there is a big piece of work to be done there as well around reducing the environmental impact of farming. Of course there is. And yes, this report is correct when it says that by the middle of the century, agriculture is currently projected to be the single biggest contributor to our carbon emissions in the UK, because we're not currently doing enough to decarbonize. But again, of course, a huge proportion of that is the way that we're farming at the minute, not necessarily what we're producing. And we've talked about that before. I know you talk about this in many other places, Finlay. But again, I'd like to see that kind of, again, that more integrated approach to the best way that we could go about farming, rather than just saying, well, you know what, the simplest thing to do is just to have less cows, less methane, good outcome.
I'd like to think that there is more of a focus going on these days on chickens and pigs, and that there is a recognition that the impact of chicken and pig systems and the enormous, numbers of chickens in particular that we eat in the UK on a weekly basis, that is actually where we want to see the reduction in numbers. And I have seen more reports dwelling on the idea that there are too many chicken produced and too many pigs produced. And I've started to see, and I've started to sort of feel, it's almost sort of feeling in my waters with my dowsing sticks, rather than necessarily seeing it, on the page too frequently. But I do feel that conversation about cattle is starting to change, because as you say, I would really like to see that assessment. And my own instinct is that we certainly don't need to see a reduction. We potentially need to see an increase in order to have, but what we really need is a redistribution of livestock, so that in those areas where livestock are more intensively grazed or more intensively housed, that actually there's a redistribution across the country, so that we have livestock integrated within other systems, arable and horticultural.
But on that massive increase in poultry consumption in the UK in the last 30 years, there has been a decrease in red meat consumption, but it's not been driven by environmental concerns or even health concerns. It's been driven, frankly, by people who know less and less how to cook the majority of the carcass of a lamb or a cow, right? It's that fundamental kind of loss of skills and knowledge around how to cook good food that's really driven that. Now, look, you can argue whether which livestock is better from an environment. We can have that conversation, right? But fundamentally, again, I think there's that kind of misconception more widely that reduction in red meat consumption is driven by this big sort of climate concern. I think the public just haven't been buying that. Yeah. But it is around the skills and the knowledge and the confidence, and of course the affordability of red meat. And that is a really important question mark, alongside much more, let's be honest, economically efficient white meat production. But yeah, it's a fascinating subject, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as you say, economically efficient. Efficient in terms of emissions, white meat production. But when we're looking at the sort of broader overall impacts then there's no doubt that you can produce the cattle in the UK that we need, that we have, in really good ecological ways that can be highly beneficial, not just from a climate perspective, but from a biodiversity and soil and water and everything else perspective as well. And just being more honest about getting people to update their knowledge on these things. And you mentioned there that the knowledge gap, the skills gap, and I talked about that earlier as well. And it's not just, as you say, about the knowledge that exists within farming, but the knowledge that exists within society. Where gone are the days when everybody used to produce a few veggies in their back garden. That has gone, but it's going to have to come back. And quite apart from the ability to cook and to know what to do with the bits that most people are just throwing away these days. Shall we move on to Dieter Helm and his analysis of the future of farming? Do you want to put this into context, or shall I just sort of put this, just start us off on this? So I tried to put a positive spin on Dieter's comments, and I should say that in a week's time, Dieter Helm is going to be on the podcast talking about this, along with Patrick Holden from the Sustainable Food Trust. So we're not going to spend forever on it, but at the same time, the rapid scaling of regen depends on pollution pricing, and I thought that was probably one of the more positive elements within there. Professor Sir Dieter Helm, who of course is the kind of godfather of natural capital in the UK, has produced a new paper, The Future of British Farming. While recognising the benefits of regenerative low-input agriculture, Helm says that the trajectory for low-input farming depends heavily on pollution pricing. He says, with comprehensive pollution pricing, charging for carbon emissions, water contamination and biodiversity damage, the economic landscape transforms entirely. He says, what government should do is to focus on the pollution and therefore closing the gap between high and low pollution production techniques, that farmers should pay for the nutrient load going into rivers, and they should face the same pressures as water companies. They should not be paid to reduce the nutrient levels. They should pay for not doing it through pollution charges. What do you think?
I think that what we see here is another very narrow take on the food system. We've basically got an economist's view on the food system. Now, I listened to Professor Sir Dieter Helm talking on, a wide range of subjects, just as you do, Finlo. Turn on Radio 4 and he'll be talking about the water industry or the transport sector. And it's always fascinating. And you think, wow, this guy's got such a fantastic grasp of the issues and really cuts through. And then when you listen to such individuals, sometimes then talk about your sector, you go, I see a lot of holes in the arguments and a lot of selective use of arguments,
which then rather undermines the way that you listen to him on other subjects. Yeah,
but this is a pure economics view of agriculture. It's some of the claims are frankly just fantastical. The fact that AI is going to do more for yields than the previous agricultural revolutions all put together have. Fundamentally, we're talking about biological systems outside in the weather. We're not going to see fundamental shifts in things like yields. We're going to see, sort of marginal gains and that sort of thing. Sir Dieter here, he's talking about essentially every acre of British farmland having data pouring out of it in torrents, going into clouds. Farmers going out of, basically becoming extinct, and farmers becoming laptop wielding mathematicians. I mean, it's nonsense. Anyone who has any actual kind of grasp, I believe, of actually what it takes to grow food on the land would be able to tell you it's nonsense. Again, we're seeing odes to vertical farming and the sort of the low emission, low pollution, high productivity a future that's provided by vertical farming. Vertical farms are going out of business left, right, and centre across the world, but even here in the UK, because they fundamentally don't work as an economic model. And one of the quotes from this piece was, given where British farming is, very low productivity, having relied on cheap migrant labour, highly polluting and creating a very low total economic value. It's a pure economic, just because the UK agriculture is only producing 0.6% of GDP, it's to completely ignore the fact that we produce so much else. and that we can produce food at the same time as providing for nature. We don't have to, I think, as Sir Dieter is suggesting, basically land sparing. He's suggesting that we should rewild large parts of the countryside or put solar panels over large parts of the countryside and farm a much smaller area much more intensively. That's essentially what he's saying. And to describe regenerative farming as glyphosate enabled no-till and kind of to leave it there again is to completely misunderstand what regenerative farming is, can be, and what it provides for society. For me, it's almost an absurd view as that of your favourite, Guardian columnist, who I won't bother to mention. And one kind of personal experience does spring to mind when we're talking about this, which is I once went to an event where Sir Dieter was talking, and this was back when we were looking at trying to get rid of direct payments, the old European-style subsidy payments. Because Sir Dieter was a big proponent that they were artificially inflating land values and rental values, and if all we had to do was get rid of subsidy payments, and they would all fall. And he used as an anecdote the fact that he had just been in a bidding war for a small holding, I think in Dartmoor, and he was appalled by the cost of this small holding. And he put the blame entirely at the door of BPS for overinflating the value of this farm he was trying to buy. And I just sat there thinking, you couldn't see the fundamental sort of irony of what he was saying. That I think what you had was two people of independent means in a bidding war for a lifestyle property. And that's what was inflating the land value, not the fact that you were getting £80 an acre from an asset that's worth £8,000 an acre. Nobody was buying land up in order to claim the BPS, which is what at the time Sir Dieter was saying. There were external factors here associated with keeping those land values vastly inflated. And of course, what we've seen is, yes, we've got rid of BPS and land values have continued to rise. So I just fundamentally worry that, again, as you say, Sir Dieter and similar people are very close to the centre of power when we talk about what Treasury's doing and how it's viewing the countryside and agricultural policy. And you cannot just look at this through this completely narrow prism of what does GCSE textbook economics tell us about agriculture? Because yes, if that's the way we look at it, it makes absolutely no sense to produce food in this country. Yeah, it's a high cost economy with very low cost or very low value food, essentially. But that's to completely ignore all the context we've just been talking about earlier on in this podcast about the importance of domestic food production and the other things that farming can provide.
I struggled through GCSE and A-level economics, and I hated it. I hated it not least because it didn't ever seem to sit within, or certainly back in those days, in the sort of late 80s, that the economics never sat within the social reality of how people actually function. It was bizarrely detached from the rest of the world, which is why I never did particularly well, because I always wanted to attach the economics to the societal elements as well, and the teachers weren't happy with that at the time. I think they would be these days. I think there's a lot more scope for that kind of conversation. It's interesting listening to the way that you've responded to the article from Dieter, or the essay, and the way that I've written it up. As I say, I've written it up as sort of trying to pull out the positive strands of what's there, where you've sort of responded to some of the rhetoric, and my own feeling, and I wonder what you think about this, Joe, is that 80% of what he says is a reasonable analysis. It's then some of the rhetoric and some of the conclusions on top of it. So what he's saying, as I've sort of written down, his analysis is that there is a technical revolution, that digitalization, AI, genetics, synthetic biology, those are all going to have an impact. And we can discuss the scale to which they're going to have an impact, but they are already having an impact. Farm financialization, the way that land and machinery and buildings are financed, the way that tractors are so expensive that you've got to have them on HP very often in order to sort of cope with that. So that sort of loads debt onto farmers in ways that didn't happen so much in the past. Quite apart from the tax landscape that exists, which although it's in flux at the moment, people have been buying up large tracts of land for tax purposes purposes for a long time. Corporate, factory scale agriculture, land competition for different things, the lack of food security, ecological reckoning. I mean, these are all things that I don't think we would necessarily disagree with that much. The question is then what we do with this information. And his conclusion is that there are three approaches for the future of land use. And I'm not sure that he's necessarily, in reading and rereading and rereading, I'm not sure that he's necessarily promoting one over and above the other, but he's saying there's either the large agribusiness sort of future, which is essentially business as usual, possibly on steroids a little, or there's natural capital delivery, and now which I would say needs to be in support of food. I'm not sure that Dieter actually says that within that. And then there's the regen and the organic approach. And what I was wanting to sort of focus on a little, just for a couple of minutes, is the idea of pollution pricing, whether charging for nitrogen use, for example, increasing the fuel duty. So there is a carbon tax on oil and diesel that's imported. Whether that would be a sensible approach to changing the way that we manage land.
No, I mean, I think again, I understand how economically that seems to make sense. We have environmental pollution, and therefore, yes, polluter pays principle. You tax the pollution, and therefore the pollution stops. But fundamentally, the problem I have with this argument is why do farmers produce food the way they produce food? Because they are being forced in a very high cost economy to produce food to the absolutely lowest possible cost. And then they're then being paid often below the cost of production for that food. At the minute, wheat is being sold for less than £160 a tonne. That is an historic low level. Now, if you're going to tax the polluter, who is the polluter in this situation? Is it the farmer who's essentially stuck within a system which is forcing him to produce food in a certain way? Or is it society more general, in more general terms, who are demanding food at that incredibly, high volumes at incredibly low cost? So for me, the fundamental problem with the argument of the polluter pays principle, and what Sir Dieter is saying is essentially tax the farmer until they're forced to produce food in a more sustainable way, which, as he points out, is a fundamentally different approach from public money for public goods, where at the minute farmers are essentially being paid, incentivized to do that. And I think that is the correct approach, because farmers are being forced and have for generations been forced to essentially inflict damage on the environment in producing food, because that is what society has been, and that's what market economics has been demanding of them. Why is organic still only 2% of the market? Because fundamentally, that's the maximum percentage of the market. That's market saturation. That's the maximum number of people who are willing to buy organic produce, because it costs more. So there's no point sort of taxing farmers into producing more expensive food that then people won't be able to afford to buy. There has to be other mechanisms to support farmers to move away from polluting practices. But those are the polluting practices that they are being forced to essentially do in order to produce the food at an affordable price point. So taxing farmers is that's not the solution.
And I guess, because there is a degree to which I'm attracted by the idea of the polluter pays sort of principle here, and the idea not just of a tax on farmers using the diesel and oil that's coming in, but on a tax on sort of fossil fuels more broadly. That, if we're seeing carbon being imported into the country, there are mechanisms that are already, in existence for increasing the cost of those, so that you kind of force the transition. However, what I would say is that this can only ever be one part of the puzzle. And the trouble is that very often governments or policymakers or economists will focus on one element of a solution, or one element of a problem, and they'll come up with an answer which by itself would potentially drive all kinds of unintended consequences. And so what we really need to see, again, is that, going back to that previous conversation, is an understanding of what land resilience, of what food resilience, of what food system resilience and health resilience, which we didn't touch on, but we might come to, in the second half, that those things are really important. And in order to deliver that, we need really strong public funding of the transition. There needs to be real investment in that transition. And if at the same time you're then bringing in a tax which it disincentivizes business as usual, then I think that's less of an issue. At the same time, I really want to see, and I'm not seeing this at the moment, I've seen a little bit of language around it, but some genuine scaling and acceleration around natural capital markets. And then the thing that you've mentioned, many times in the past, is the idea of actually upholding standards, British standards in trading arrangements globally. So you have all these things together, then I think you have the potential to accelerate change. You do one thing alone, then you create distortions.
And what we're going to see, I think, in 2027 is a carbon border adjustment mechanism applied to fertilizer and other high energy, high carbon imports, which I'm sure, again, Sardita would welcome. But again, all that's going to do is potentially put 25% on the cost of domestic fertilizer it's going to add 25% to farmers' fertilizer bills, which they're then not going to be able to pass on. So yeah, absolutely. If the profitability is there to somehow subsidize that, then that's fine. But as you say, Finlo, if you whack a single sort of solution onto things in the complete absence of a more generalized ecosystem to allow that to be bearable, then you're going to achieve nothing except offshoring our food production abroad. So this goes back to our previous conversation about the AFN Plus report. There's what are the blockers to actually starting to go down this more holistic approach to our food system? And again, for me, Sardita's report it's basically chosen a winner, and for me, it is an unrealistic. It's a fantastical future, which just doesn't have. It doesn't ring true to me. And again, it's looking to essentially penalise farmers for society's sins. And for me, again, with farmers already on their knees, I don't see any legs in that whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. So again, sort of coupling these conversations together, it's about having a really clear assessment, without that sort of starry-eyed approach, as I sort of mentioned before. I think so many people have different views about what society is going to do and how it's going to respond in different things. But until we have clear-eyed assessments of what the external threats are, of what the internal challenges are in response to that, and then we've taken away this sort of approach to these issues, the sort of single issue approach, so that we can start to look at things holistically, we're not going to be able to make progress. And so in terms of those blockers that you were talking about, it's getting rid of single issue lenses. Yet they're useful enough in order to be able to have a conversation to start with, but you very rapidly need to move on to where they sit within that sort of broader, more holistic understanding, and then some genuine clear assessments of these things that are currently missing. Joe, let's take a break. And we're back, and we're going to talk about that Lloyds report that I mentioned earlier on, addressing climate and nature risk in UK farming. And we're going to ask whether UK-style class actions can help to arrest ecological decline. So we're not going to spend that long on these individual stories. I think we've got 3 or 4 just to kind of whip through before the end, Joe. But the first one was Lloyds Farm Report aims to help farmers reduce climate and nature risk. Lloyds have launched Farming with Nature, mapping the growth opportunity for UK agriculture, a comprehensive analysis mapping 5.1 million hectares, almost a third of the UK's farmed land, using geospatial data, on-farm assessments and new economic insight. The report also marks the introduction of Lloyds Agricultural Transition Finance, a new product which will be launching later this year. The report identifies 1.2 million hectares of UK farmland with the highest potential for habitat creation, 600,000 hectares prime land of land that's prime for trees and hedges, and then 700,000 hectares in drought-prone regions that could benefit from improved water management. And they've used Earth Blocks, which is a platform using satellite data to come to those conclusions. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a nice report. I'm not sure there's a huge amount in there which is kind of groundbreaking. I think it's part of that corpus of evidence, which is very welcome. That's building, which is demonstrating that there is probably that there is a better way to manage our land, a more regenerative way, a more sustainable way. I think some of those figures you've just read out there, Finlo, and some of the maps that come with it, it's great. But it's basically saying, look, in the east where there's lots of arable crops, maybe we should be growing more cover crops. In the west where we've got more livestock, maybe we should be using more legume fallows, right, and more herbal lays to sort of increase the resilience of our livestock production. It's, which is absolutely right. And again, hopefully, sort of people within the food supply chain, people within government, people within the finance sector will pick this up, and it'll just be another kind of spur to kind of better educate people kind of outside the farming sector. So it's very welcome. I think it's linked, isn't it, with Lloyds planning to launch a sort of a regenerative transition finance product later in the year. I don't think there's any details of that as of yet, but presumably it will be much in line with similar products already available from banks such as Oxbury, from HSBC. And they're welcome. They offer beneficial terms for finance, for credit to farms looking to fund more regenerative practices. They're never going to be game changing. It's going to be one small element of how we help finance this regenerative transition. But it's welcome, and it's great to see a big agricultural lender like Lloyds recognizing the benefits, the wider benefits. Again, it's not just about food production; it's also about natural capital that more regenerative farming can bring. And it's great to see that, again, a big corporate giant like Lloyds is getting on that bandwagon and throwing its weight behind behind that rolling ball. We want to see that snowball picking up more and more mass. So yeah, it's welcome to see them talking about this.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that. That it's welcome to see them talking about it. But I can't remember quite the phrase that you used earlier on. But it was essentially it's another report which is telling us to a certain extent what we already know. And I think that's the thing that I'm kind of pulling out of Lloyds, because Lloyds often present these reports in a big fanfare as if they are, they're sort of keen insights that nobody's had before. But really, they're talking about cover cropping, they're talking about tree planting, they're talking about water management, and they're not. Again, they're identifying little bits of land, or 700,000 hectares of land, but it's still part of the land where we ought to be thinking about water management, rather than actually that we need to be thinking about water cycling on all land. And if farmers are thinking about a regenerative approach to their farm, to their production systems, then they need to be understanding how these things work and integrating them across. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's some use in this sort of satellite information, but I do tend to feel a bit underwhelmed by Lloyd's reports, and that's which I'm always sort of cautious to say, but at the same time they seem to be a little bit behind, and then saying something which is essentially the bleeding obvious. And does that reflect what you would think?
I mean, I think you always have to treat big numbers kind of with a great deal of skepticism. Of course, one of the prime things about regenerative farming and about any farming is the context, right? So big shaded boxes on maps and all the rest of it. As with anything, you do have to treat with a certain dose of skepticism. But look, it's fantastic that a big corporate giant like Lloyd's is basically it's part of this conversation, and they are clear. We're hopefully here we're pushing open doors, right? Increasingly pushing at open doors. But I think again we're all kind of saying the same thing, which is we need that private finance to be coming in. We're all kind of waiting for that private finance to appear. We're not seeing that private finance, and again. Look, this is a serious player. Hopefully, the more serious players start to say the same things. We'll start to see more of that money actually coming into play.
Yeah, fantastic. And, I don't want people to get the wrong idea. I mean, it is welcome to see this. And what's even more welcome is that Lloyds, as this sort of great big lender, are doing a lot of work with Soil Association Exchange that I think is a really important organisation, sort of sharing data and sharing knowledge in that way. I just wish that, they would get their reports out a bit faster and be on the front foot rather than just kind of stepping in other people's treads, I suppose.
I imagine there's a lot of different circles of corporate something that you need to go through before you can release a report.
I bet there are. Let's move on to the next, which is extreme weather is making our bread less British. And of course, these are all headlines on 8.9.com. I'm just going to set the context here. Analysis by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, the ECIU, of UK harvest data suggests that extreme weather so far in the 2020s has played a major role in creating a total deficit in wheat production of over 7 million tonnes. When considering the proportion of UK production used for milling flour, flour. This is enough wheat to bake over 4 billion loaves of bread. With a population of 69 million people, this equates to 64 loaves of bread for every person in the UK over a year's supply. Tom Lancaster, the land, food and farming analyst at the ECIU, said, "This is what farming in a changing climate looks like. Extreme weather is making our bread less British, as millers have to turn to imports due to shortfalls in UK production, costing farmers billions in lost income and reducing our self-sufficiency in our main staple crop. Although we can do more to support our farmers to adapt to these extremes, only reducing planet warming emissions to net zero can prevent these losses to extreme weather escalating in the years to come." Now, when I received this press release, I have to say that it had a different headline, and I pulled that out because I thought it was rather a sort of tongue-in-cheek, slightly cheeky sort of hat tip to nationalism. That reform and many of the nationalists, of that ilk, tend to be climate change deniers or against net zero in one form or another. But here we are. It's extreme weather. It's climate change that's making our bread less British. We need more British bread. Therefore, we need to address climate change, Joe.
Yeah, well, maybe if they come to power in a few years, they can just sort of ban the import of foreign wheat. Maybe that'll sort of be one way of coming here on our boats and stealing our loaves. That'll be one way of doing it. But no, yeah, I mean it's a relatively simple story, isn't it?
It is.
We've now had three of the worst five harvests on record this decade, and it's 2025. So, we are clearly facing huge volatility in domestic food production. We've talked about this before. And yeah, we're now looking at sort of record amounts of imports to make up that shortfall in the last couple of years. Of course, we're always going to have a requirement for imported wheat. We can't grow that kind of hard red wheat, high protein wheat with that sort of consistent high protein levels in the UK because of our climate, because of the size of our farms. We just can't do that. So we're always going to have a certain requirement. But yeah, absolutely. Wheat, the staple UK crop, is becoming harder to grow. I see we're starting to grow rice in the UK now. There's a farm in near Ely at the minute that's growing the first UK trials of rice. Undoubtedly we're going to see different crops being grown here. But I think we're a long way away from rice replacing wheat as our main domestic carbohydrate. But I think your point, Finlo, yes, around that kind of that confusion, that policy confusion by reform, that essentially they're going to repeal all of the kind of net zero and climate policy, and they're backing farmers, but at the same time, of course, very, very happy to sign trade deals with places like the US and import lower quality food from elsewhere, whilst saying that one of the big benefits of Brexit is that we can do that and we can import food and we can reduce consumer, we can get ever cheaper food. Yes, look, for me, on that particular point, there's a great deal of confusion around Reform's policy platform when it comes to agriculture. I would certainly encourage farmers to take a bit of a closer look at it before they get too far on that bandwagon.
Yeah, absolutely. The nationalist response to food system change really needs to be about additional resilience, making sure that we address climate change, that we get the water cycling and the biodiversity and the soil fertility that we need. So it'll be interesting to see if that policy emerges from Reform in due course. Moving on, 4,000 people join Wye production legal claim against chicken firms. A legal claim which almost 4,000 people have joined, challenging river pollution in the Wye and Usk catchment areas, has now been filed with the High Court. The court action is against chicken production firms Avara Foods Limited and Freeman's of Newent Limited, as well as a sewage company, Welsh Water or Dŵr Cymru. They're blamed for extensive and widespread pollution in the rivers Wye and Lug and their tributaries. And we're talking here about 3,943 people who've signed up to be claimants. They're all residents, local business owners, or people who use the rivers Wye, Usk and Lug for leisure and family time, including people with riverside properties or fishing rights, other householders or tenants who live and run businesses near to intensive poultry units. It's about the smell, I think, and things like that, and dust, chicken growing farms, sewage infrastructure, businesses who rely on local tourism and river activities who have also joined the claim. Now, there were two reasons for talking about this. The first is, let's just kind of look at that claim and whether it's a realistic one. The idea that chicken farms are the key polluters in the Wye, Usk, and Lug regions. But then also, and I think this is almost the more interesting element, is this idea of importing the idea of a class action, which is a US thing. It doesn't exist in terms of legal procedures in the UK, but this idea of mass claimants on a particular thing in order to drive ecological change. Your views, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, this is the story that just keeps coming back and back, isn't it? The whole Wye-Usk Valley and the water quality down there. Look, I think we fundamentally sort of have a similar view on this, Finlo, and I agree with, clearly there is an issue, down there with water quality and agriculture's impact on that. Of course, agriculture nationally has a significant impact on water quality, and we can't shy away from that. There's much that we can do to improve that. However, I think, it's also overstated the extent to which agriculture is responsible for the problems in that part of the world in particular. I've sat through a briefing from the Environment Agency that says, you know what, look, actually the major problem really is climate change. Again, it's low water levels, it's high water temperatures. It's not necessarily the amount of phosphate that we're finding in the river. In fact, phosphate levels are much higher in other rivers around the country. So it's a multifaceted, complex issue. Of course, but it's really easy to just boil that down into there's too many chickens in this catchment. That's the problem, and that's how we're going to go after it. As with many issues when it comes to food farming and the environment, I wish there was more nuance. Of course, nuance doesn't really lend itself to a class action lawsuit. I know you've got thoughts on that as a mechanism, Finlay.
Well, I think it's quite an interesting one. I'm generally of the view that an awful lot of environmental campaigning is money that's wasted in various different ways. That there are an awful lot of NGOs who are campaigning for public awareness raising and policy change. But actually, if you really want to get a bang for your buck, if you really want to make change, then the legal system is the way to do it. The way that the law works and treats society at large, if you can make a change in the law or create a precedent and do it, at reasonably limited expense, then you're likely to drive that change more quickly. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot more sort of legal actions taking place and a lot more organizations, whether it's Lee Day, who are, doing this in this particular instance, or I think you mentioned to me earlier before the podcast, Wild Justice, at the same time, Client Earth. There are lots of organizations that are starting to do this. I mean, I may not always agree with the things that they're picking up to create that legal case around. And sometimes those organizations are being a bit simplistic about their understanding of these things. But at the same time, it does get them coverage. And it does mean that if they win, there will be a change that is forced and, sort of foisted upon people.
But it's but when you're looking at it through that incredibly narrow lens of a single issue, and often, I don't know if distorting the evidence is the right way of putting it, but you're not often going to get a good outcome from that. And when we should be having more nuanced, more complex conversations, and we should be acknowledging that there are pros and cons to pretty much any decision that we can make. I find that the concept of sort of legislating via lawsuit, where you have to have a winner, you have to have a loser, you have to have sort of a binary kind of zero sum game. I just don't personally. I think that's a bad way of going about things. And again, who is probably almost inevitably going to get caught up in the crossfire here, and it's usually going to be farmers. We've got moves afoot by other sort of campaigning organisations to have farmyard manures reclassified as waste products, which need to be incinerated rather than applied to land. These are the sorts of crazy sort of scenarios that you have to then start considering, and the implications that would have for our food system as we're trying to wean ourselves off, carbon heavy synthetic fertilizers. If we then end up having to incinerate our manures, that would just be nuts. But again, this is the problem when you have single issue groups going after single issue outcomes. And that, I have concerns, it's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with those concerns. I think they're, they're reasonable in every way. But at the same time, I just find the whole approach of using the law quite interesting, because I think it can be powerful and it can be, productive, as I say, in terms of, those donations. And I do wonder, I mean, what I'm interested in here, because there's no question in my mind, from what I've seen, that chickens are a very significant part of the problem, in those rivers. But at the same time, they are only part of the problem, and there are lots of other things, and you listed some of them yourself there. And so the question is whether the court process is able to deal with that differentiation, perhaps in a way that legislators find more difficult. Whether the court process can look at things and say, well, we can understand this in context. The chicken production is a problem; it's only part of a problem, and therefore, how are we going to deal with that in a legal sense? Are we going to award some damages but not all damages? And I kind of, I sort of thinking back to the way that the tobacco companies were arguing, trying to sort of say that, well, there could be all kinds of reasons for lung disease. It isn't us. So it's really hard to sort of point that and find that smoking gun. I guess a final thought around that is the way that if these are jury trials, I mean, when we were looking at the AFN Network Plus, they were talking about wanting to have more citizens' assemblies. And I've never been entirely convinced by the notion of citizens' assemblies. I'm yet to be convinced in that. But essentially, a jury is a small citizens' assembly being presented with evidence. And I'm just fascinated to see what the outcome of these things will be. It's not that I'm sort of interested in pushing one outcome or another. I'm just interested to take a back seat and see where these things go.
Yeah, I mean, look, by no means is policy creation the way we currently do it perfect. I mean, for me, a good example. I mean, why don't we launch a class action lawsuit, taking the government to task over its claim, for example, that the badger cull is an ineffective means of controlling bovine TB, when its own data seems to very clearly state that the opposite is true, and yet we're about to lose that as a mechanism to control that incredibly insidious and expensive disease as the livestock industry in the UK. If that was put before a judge who was forced to actually consider the evidence and rule without thought of urban voters, I wonder what the outcome would be. So you know what, maybe there's an opportunity there for us to play this sort of from the other side. But again, look, I just can't help but feel that yes, complex issues deserve complex and effective policy making, and yeah, of course, maybe you're right, Finlay. Maybe what we're seeing here is just a symptom of our increasingly dysfunctional and short-term policy making system.
And confused. It's complex, isn't it? Really complex, and having solutions to issues that are complex can often be very challenging and don't just require a dealing with facts necessarily. I mean, you mentioned the badger cull there. That's probably a conversation for another time. And I mean, plenty of the the facts that I've seen from people like the RSPCA and even from government would take the contrary approach to the one, or contrary sort of conclusion to the one that you've outlined there. But what a government has to do in terms of policy is to look at facts, then to interpret those facts in terms of its own political persuasions, its own sort of policy, the policy outcomes it wants to see, and really about public acceptability. So sometimes, even if you were right, Joe, and I'm not suggesting that one or the other of us is correct on the badger cull, regardless of the rightness of either of us, it's a political decision. It's a decision that's taken, with the public in mind, and the court process is going to be a different process. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Should we move on to our last story, which is using nature to help tackle mental health issues? And I don't think we're going to spend very long on this. It's just, sort of flagging it up as an idea. Healthcare professionals are using nature to tackle a range of mental health issues in one of the most densely populated areas of the UK, thanks to a new project. This is the RSPB's Nature Prescription Scheme in the West Midlands, reaching an impressive milestone this October, with 150 practitioners now trained and given enough resources to help their first 1,000 patients. Speaking about nature prescriptions, RSPB President and NHS GP Dr. Amir Khan said, "As a GP, I've seen firsthand how beneficial time spent in nature can be. Free services such as nature prescriptions empower healthcare professionals to guide patients towards meaningful connections with nature, helping to improve their well-being alongside any other required care or treatments. Whether it's a simple walk in the park or a local green space, listening to birdsong, or simply watching leaves flutter in the breeze, nature has a profound impact on our mental health. Time spent outdoors stimulates serotonin, which is the brain's happy chemical, and just 10 to 15 minutes in nature a day can lift our mood, reduce anxiety, and increase feelings of calm. And what I wanted to do was to sort of connect this not only with mental health, but to health more broadly. And I wondered if you had any immediate thoughts, Joe.
No, again, this is one of those things that, yeah, the farmed landscape can deliver for society. I mean, we know the huge costs of mental health or poor mental health on society, on the NHS every year. And yeah, look, I mean, every time I visit London, for example, I'm just struck by, and I guess I'm not used to living in that environment necessarily, but you are just struck, you just feel constrained, you feel, it feels grey, it feels, it's not, it doesn't feel like where we should naturally be. And of course that's the experience of the majority of people these days. Majority of people live in those urban environments. So you can absolutely, I can absolutely get behind the concept that being out in nature is going to be positive for your mental health. And again, it's kind of going back to some of our earlier stories here, Finlo. It's one of those things that is not reflected in that 0.6% of GDP delivered by agriculture, right? It's one of those things that we can provide society that's generally not appreciated. So absolutely, what more can agriculture and landscape managers, what can we provide for society? And I think this is a great example of something that's probably completely underutilized at present.
Indeed. And, it's about making use of those free resources in the same way that regenerative farmers are trying to make use of the free energy resources that are coming from the sun or from the rain. And I think, part of this is about sort of making the case that nature is important, and making the case to taxpayers, to the public at large, to people who live in cities and towns, and sometimes even in villages, who are distant from nature and don't understand the importance of it, and therefore trying to make the case for spending more money on that rather than directly into the NHS or to education. It's difficult. And so understanding this in sort of circular motions, I suppose, around that well-being and poor mental health are really important, and nature can help with that. Understanding that nature-friendly farming and reduced nutrient use, or sort of nitrogen use, fertilizer use, that sort of thing, better fertility coming from the soil can give us better, more nutritious, healthier food. And you sort of connect these things together. If you've got poor health outcomes, and there's no doubt that we have some really appallingly poor physical health outcomes in this country. When you have poor health, which often has been achieved through eating the wrong kinds of food, that can lead to low self-esteem, poor well-being, poor mental health as well. So these things are circular, and again, making the case for nature, making the case for investment in nature benefits us in so many different ways, and this is just talking about one of those ways.
And just to sort of to finish this off, Finlo, and again to take back to what we're talking about earlier, it's that always that often that missing point between, it's not just calories, it's nutrition, right? It's the quality of the food we eat. It's not just talking about, well, let's get rid of all the cows and let's just have more carbohydrates and more calories. It's the quality of the food. It's more than just the bulk of what we can sort of put down our throats, right? And it's that's for me what's fundamental with this whole kind of agroecological view of the food system, that we should be looking at it much more widely, and what it can then deliver, not only for mental well-being and physical health, but then the costs that saves to the economy more generally. It's this incredibly holistic view of things, and that's what I think is incredibly exciting. But it just feels that we are always so far away from having sort of serious conversations about that outside of the kind of the niches that sort of of the agricultural sector, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that's, I welcome this as a news story, and let's we again, going back to what we've been talking about earlier, we need to see more and more of these kind of reports saying the same thing, so that hopefully we can just get some head of steam behind it, so that we can demonstrate really what a well-managed countryside can deliver for society.
Absolutely. Small investments in nature can deliver, incredible cost savings overall in terms of whether that's flooding or health aspects, making sure that we have a healthy nation that's physically able to go out and work and to learn, all of these different things. It's all connected. And the cost of making sure that we have a really abundant, diverse nature really isn't that great. And we just need to get on with spending some money there. Well, look, that's it. And thanks, Joe. Really enjoyed having a conversation with you. And I hope, if you've been listening to this, that you've enjoyed listening. And if you have, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is the world's highest ranking food security podcast, as Joe very kindly mentioned earlier on. And Farmgate Leaders and Martin's Farm are available if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. And if you'd like to find out how to sponsor Farmgate and to advertise on the programme, then please do get in touch. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been ffinlo Costain. Bye for now.
I've been Joe Stanley. Thanks for joining us.